Thank you very much. So today I will present research based on my personal experience, my personal lived experience as a cochlear implant recipient. Because for my left ear, which I lost 6 years ago, I had a cochlear implant just 6 months after I lost hearing in my left ear. So I have now about 6 years of experience listening to the world and attempting to hear music with that cochlear implant, and that experience is what actually motivated me to do the last 6 years of work in this area, because I know what it sounds like to listen to music through a cochlear implant. Okay, so I will read to you what I've written on this title slide, so you can hear me say what the title of my paper is. You can read it for yourself. It's Examining the Auditory Perceptual World of Cochlear Implant Recipients Through Their Differential Assessment of Musical Instrument Timbres. And I've already had an introduction, so you already know that I'm from Australia now, even though I haven't been living in Australia for more than
just checking the mic.
The last...
Oh, it's working.
It's working.
Yep.
I hope it's loud enough. I hope you can hear me well enough, because I can't speak much louder than this. I will strain my voice and I won't make it through the full 50 minutes that I have allotted for my presentation. So let's just move right on to the first slide. So I'm going to talk about the perception of music by cochlear implant. I think a very good place to start is just to ask the question, why should we care? Why would we care about how music sounds to CI recipients? I have an answer that I like. My answer is we should care about this because many CI recipients would like to enjoy music that sounds as good as it used to sound before the implantation. Now, I have personal experience, so I can tell you it's not the same. It's a different sound now listening to music than it was before my implant. And it's bad enough that it motivates me to do 6 years of work. You know, before I was doing this work on how music sounds to a cochlear implant recipient, I did about 45 years of research on normal hearing music with a normal ear. That's what I had. Guess what? I still have one normal ear left. So I can compare what does music sound like to my right ear, which is normal hearing, to the way it sounds listening through, I like to call my electric ear. Through my cochlear implant, I call it my electric ear. You know, if you call me on my mobile phone, which is paired to the processor that I wear on my head, that talks to the cochlear implant, which is implanted into my cochlea. You can talk to me from far away. You could call me from Korea, and I would hear you in Sydney, Australia, and no one else could ever hear it in Sydney because there's no sound. At my end, there's no sound at all because it's an electric stimulus applied to my cochlea. There's no sound. Now, of course, when I say sound in this case, I mean there's no physical sound. I have the experience of sound in my mind, but there's no physical sound stimulus anywhere near me if you're calling me from Korea. And so I'm hearing the sound of your voice in a strictly personal way that is electrically transduced by electrodes that stimulate my cochlea. All right. Now, if I elaborate long-windedly like this on every slide, I won't finish. So I should go ahead and just read through this page for you so you can see where I'm headed now. Music perception by CI recipients. I'm going to call cochlear implants CI, just for shorthand for the rest of my presentation. CI recipients typically experience grossly impoverished music. It's degraded by their ability to recognize the pitch class of individual notes. And also it's degraded by the CI listener's failure to differentiate between the musical timbre of orchestral instruments. That's right. These are probably the two most important elements of music perception. You've got to be able to hear pitch, and you've got to be able to hear musical timbre. And guess what? Both are significantly degraded by use of a cochlear implant. So what I've said, I'll reiterate now, sadly, many CI recipients feel they have lost the ability to enjoy music. It sounds electric, it sounds different. So music is sounding, versus the electric hearing they have with the cochlear implant, so different from their memories of what music used to sound like using acoustic hearing. And by acoustic hearing, you know what I mean is the normal hearing of the remaining normal ear. So what is the central research question that I want to address today? It's just this one regarding how to assess how different music might sound to a CI recipient. Now, you might wonder why this is so interesting to someone as a scientific research project. Maybe you just want to ask people to have a cochlear implant what the world sounds like to them or what the music sounds like to them, and you'll be done. But you know, there's something available by doing rigorous scientific studies that test what CI recipients can hear when they listen to musical stimuli. And for me, what it is the assessment of the outcome of the implantation for each individual so that we can assess how bad it might be or what we can do to improve it. And if we try to improve it, we need a way to assess whether we have improved it. And so I'm proposing a fairly rigorous program of perceptual research using musical sound and asking the cochlear implants to respond on simple psychophysical tasks, discrimination tests, dissimilarity judgments, and so forth. So that's what I'll do today. I'll talk about that work. Now, there's plenty of good literature out there on the perception and cognition of musical timbre. And so this is not a new field at all. In fact, I have been doing work on musical timbre since the 70s. So more than 45 years I've been doing work on musical timbre. However, what I'm going to talk about now, what it sounds like through cochlear implants, is not really treated in this book. This book doesn't talk about how musical timbre sounds to a CI recipient. But I do recommend this book because there's so much good research here and so much valuable understanding of what's required to understand music, to enjoy music, and what the key elements are in musical timbre and the musical stimulus that make a difference to your ability to appreciate music. So musical timbre, you might say, it's not really the whole picture at all. Musical timbre is just one part of a much bigger picture. In music appreciation, clearly you need to also appreciate pitch. Now, my presentation today is not really about musical pitch. However, I will give you some of my experience with musical pitch via my own CI as well. But first, let's look at the big picture. I'm going to focus on timbre, yes, but let's look at the big picture first before we proceed. What are the important perceptual elements of music? You should be nodding your heads right about now saying, yes, yes, we want to know. What do you think the important perceptual elements of music are? Well, let's look and see. Are they pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics? It's a good start. Let's go with those four. Now I'm going to show you which one of these are more degraded by the CI use. Can you guess already? It's pitch. Absolutely. Pitch, a big problem for cochlear implant recipients. Why? There's no temporal fine structure getting through a CI. Now, you know what I mean by temporal fine structure. There's no waveform hitting my cochlea. You know how a cochlear implant works. A very slowly varying amplitude envelope that is calculated on the sound that is captured by a microphone. That slowly varying amplitude envelope at each frequency for each electrode is applied as a current to the electrode. There's no audio signal. You could call it an audio signal, but it's got maybe very, very slow variation. Maybe to see a good picture of it, you have to sample it at 20 hertz. It doesn't change rapidly. Okay, so I've already indicated with a red stop sign Under pitch, I've got 2 red stop signs. Now, the red stop sign is supposed to give you the impression that something's wrong here. Something is stopped. And what is stopped by the cochlear implant? Well, you have no way to hear 2 sounds at once. You can't segregate 2 sounds that are sounding simultaneously with a CI. So you have the fusion of simultaneous instrument sounds into one sound. What else is stopped? What else is stopped with regard to pitch is consonance and dissonance are not distinguished. Now, what do I mean by consonance and dissonance? I think the musicians, the audience all know. Please, everybody, nod your head. Yeah, consonance is when things sound mellifluous and harmonious. And at the beginning of a piece of music and at the end, you usually hear something rather consonant, like a chord that's in the key that you're in. What is dissonant? Often you hear dissonance in a sequence of chords that creates a tension that has to be resolved. And so it's so important in hearing music that you have dissonance resolving into consonance. It's the big climax at the end of every bar or so. Every 8 bars. However often you need to have a resolution. So if you can't hear the difference between consonance and dissonance, you're going to be missing a lot of what is the structure of the music that you're wanting to hear. This is one of the form-bearing elements of music, is the fluctuation between consonance and dissonance. Okay, so now I hope the story is going to get better for the CI recipient. Let's see. These 2 are stop signs because they're no good. This is a sad story. But the happy story is rhythm is still there. That means rhythmic patterns still survive. If you apply that slow varying amplitude envelope to each of my electrodes, I can still hear the rhythm. And guess what else? The tempo remains intact. It means I can tap my foot to the beat. You can't see it, I'm tapping my foot. I'm tapping my foot here to indicate that I can follow the beat. I understand tempo. So those 2 things are great. I guess it means if I wanted to give up on playing an instrument that needs pitch for a melody, maybe I'll just play drums from now. And then I'll be banging on a drum with the right tempo and the right rhythmic pattern, and I'll be able to perform. But I'm not going to be able to perform very well on the pitched instruments that I've been playing on. What else is a stop sign here? Timbre. Timbre is a stop sign because you have confusion between the different instrument sounds that you'd like to be able to hear and discriminate in order so you can hear the harmony between 2 different lines. And the instruments themselves, they don't sound pretty anymore, they sound metallic. If you search online, what does the CI recipient hear when they hear musical instruments? Well, when they hear music, it sounds like pots and pans falling down the stairs. It's not a bad description. Can you imagine? Pots and pans falling. Now, maybe you like that kind of music, but that's actually quite unusual that people will like just music that sounds like pots and pans falling down the stairs. What about dynamics? We're hoping maybe you can hear the swell of a crescendo getting louder and then softer again. Oh, sorry, not that either. We don't have that either because there's limited comfortable dynamic range with a cochlear implant. It has to be loud enough to drive for the current to drive a perception of sound. But you know what? If it gets too loud, do you know what happens? You know what? This cochlear implant is stimulating the auditory nerve, almost directly stimulating the auditory nerve. That's the cranial nerve that carries sound from the cochlea. It also carries information from the vestibular system and haptic sensation on the face, which means if the stimulation of the cochlea is at too large a current, you know what's going to happen? You're going to feel it in your face. You're going to have haptic sensation, which means you'll feel it like somebody's touching your skin, and you won't like it. I don't. So I make sure I don't let the current go too high for my cochlear implant. That's a problem for music because music needs to have dynamics. What else does music need? It needs space. Almost all music exists in space, doesn't it? Even if you're just listening to a single loudspeaker, it's still heard in a space, and space is important to music. The distribution of multiple instruments across a soundstage, it's an important part of appreciating music. So, I've indicated that I think timbre is an important perceptual element of music. Pitch is also, of course, an important perceptual element. So now I'm going to quickly run through some personal observations of my own, using my own cochlear implant. And these are aside from today's focus, which is really on the musical timbre research that I've done. But I want to tell you what my perception of pitch is like via the cochlear implant. Well, it's extremely poor. First, in everyday listening to music, I recognize melodies because I hear changes in pitch height, only pitch height, without recognizing the musical pitch class of individual notes. Now, if you know what pitch class means, it's the difference between a C and a D and an E as you move around a circle, traveling from C up an octave back to C. That's a variation in pitch class. And when you go up an octave higher and higher and higher, it's the pitch height that is varying. So, another thing that's kind of sad is I hear clear pitch only in the laboratory. When I have laboratory sessions that use direct stimulation via a software interface that applies current at very low modulation rates, maybe around 50 hertz. If I use the microphone and the conventional processor, which is a processor that is developed by Cochlear Limited of Australia, they have half the market of the cochlear implant products out in the world. Of the million people in the world, there's more than 1 million people who have cochlear implants. Half of those use cochlear implants from the company in Sydney, Australia called Cochlear Limited. And I've got their processor. Honestly, I put it in my bag over there. I'm not even going to show it to you. Third, I hear the place pitch that is associated with each of those 22 electrodes. Those electrodes are placed along the basilar membrane. You know, the cochlea is a spiral with a membrane, and sound travels only so far if it's high frequency, but it travels deeper if it is lower frequency. And so the 22 electrodes are positioned along that basilar membrane, and each one of them gives rise to one pitch and only one pitch. That means I've only got 22 pitches. Not only that, but they don't change. Those pitches don't change. They're fixed. They're fixed by the position on the basilar membrane that's stimulated, so I can't have more than 22 pitches. Most Western music uses more than 22 pitches, of course. So let's try understanding the perception of musical pitch for melody recognition tasks. I tell you about this because there's many reports in the literature that say because CI recipients can recognize melodies, they must hear pitch. But you know what? My experience is the people who recognize melodies are recognizing it because of variation in pitch height, not because of the notes that they hear, because the musical notes with the different pitch classes like C, D, and E, they're not heard. We don't hear that. Cochlear implants don't hear pitch class. Maybe you're familiar with this distinction between pitch class, also in the literature called pitch chroma. For the last 60 years, ever since Shepard wrote a paper showing this helix, this spiral, well, melody recognition of CI recipients, we really have to distinguish between these two dimensions of pitch perception, which are pitch height, which is related to the spectral centroid. For those in the audience who really care about the physical analysis of the signal, you can predict pitch height from the spectral centroid of the signal. You can't predict pitch chroma from that. Pitch chroma is actually more easily predicted by looking at the periodicity of the waveform and finding out what the fundamental frequency is. And that gives you the pitch class, which often has been termed just pitch within an octave. How does pitch vary within an octave? By pitch class. And you see that spiral is what I'm talking about. Now, just to make sure you're following me, if you have the 12 tones chromatically arrayed on a piano in a circle like this, or just increase in semitone steps around the circle, that's what we mean by pitch class. And just to make a nice 3D graphic out of it, I'll show just the diatonic scale. Here's just the 7 notes that make up the scale on a piano when you're playing just the white keys. It's a diatonic scale. We've left out all the sharps and flats. If I do a 3D graphic for this, trying to represent how pitch height increases linearly from bottom to top, the pitch chroma is the helical dimension, the circular dimension of the helix. Okay. Now I've also done an investigation of musical interval identification. And why is this important? Because you can't hear musical intervals if you can only hear one sound. Musical intervals means the relationship between 2 sounds that are heard simultaneously. What's the interval between them? And it's pretty much dependent on hearing the frequency ratio, like between a C and a G. If the 2 notes that you hear are C and G, then the interval is called a perfect fifth. If it's between C and F, it's a perfect fourth. And with the CI, these are all potentially confusable. And also, surprisingly, those 2 intervals are confusable with the tritone between C and F sharp, which is actually something that will sound very different to your normal ear because you'll hear it as very discordant. It won't be consonant, it'll sound very dissonant. But when I play those 3 musical intervals, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, and a tritone, they don't sound that different. Now, to a normal hearing ear, they'll sound very different. So I'm going to show you what the result of a test might look like for normal hearing listeners to a continuous distribution of frequency ratios that pass from perfect fourth through tritone to the perfect fifth. And that's what I'm going to show you here. I'm going to show you the results of a 3-category response task where the 3 allowed responses are, oh, that's a perfect fourth, that's a tritone, or that's a perfect fifth. And they're only varying between about 5 semitones and 7 semitones. But here they are actually smoothly varying. The frequency ratios are gradually changing across the range of those 3 notes here. If I look and fit a smooth curve to my responses saying that was a perfect fourth, it looks like this. So if it's 500 cents, a cent is 1/100th of a semitone. So if you're at 500 cents, I'll say P4 all the time because I'm listening with a normal ear. If it's up near 700, it's a perfect fifth most of the time. And in between, I'm getting it right there too. I'm actually pretty accurate, doing well with my normal hearing. So I fit smooth curves to these so I can compare the smooth curves quickly and easily between normal hearing listeners' responses. This is a typical response of someone who can detect the differences. Here it is with a CI. It's almost indistinguishable from chance response. In other words, we're not hearing the differences. It looks like maybe we're able to hear a little bit of dissonance from the tritone. I don't think so. I think it might be pitch height related, frankly. You're able to guess better than chance by a little margin, but you're not hearing the musical intervals. You don't hear the musical harmony. Why do I say that? I only know that in my case. I don't. So this is a personal experience that I'm reporting on, and I think it's likely that most CI recipients have the same experience I do. Okay, so now I'm going to stop talking about pitch, because I'm about halfway through my presentation now. I have to switch back to talking about timbre, but I wanted to tell you about pitch because I think it's so important. Yeah, pitch is important, but timbre is also a very important perceptual element of music. So let's look down back in that diagram that I showed before. Timbre, you have confusion between instrument sounds and the instruments sound unpleasantly metallic. So why is it that the timbre is so severely degraded, and why is it so hard to differentiate between timbres with a CI? Well, first of all, remember I already explained how the current transduction of an audio signal is just a slowly varying envelope at each harmonic. Well, that means you've lost all the temporal structure. If you've lost the temporal structure, then there's no way you can distinguish between these 2 waveforms that I've shown on this sheet. On this graph, the odd harmonics that are summed up with about a 6 dB fall off per octave, you sum them up and you're going to get something that looks like a square wave, right? Yes, you know that, right? And if you sum up the even harmonics, it's going to look like a ramp. Of course, because I'm summing up the even harmonics here, they'll have a different fundamental. It'll be at 2F. The fundamental will be twice as high. So what do you hear when you hear these two with a normal ear? Well, you hear something that sounds like a clarinet. When you hear the odd harmonics, it'll sound hollow, like a clarinet does. But for the same fundamental frequency of signal, if you just sum up the second harmonics, the second, fourth, and sixth, the even harmonics, well, the lowest is going to be the second harmonic, so it's going to sound like it's an octave higher, but it's going to sound like an oboe. The spectra of the two complex tonal signals that I just showed you, there's the odd harmonics, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Here's the even. Sure enough, the odd harmonics, sum them up, they'll sound like a clarinet. And you sum up the even ones, they'll sound like an oboe. And now I want to show you the stimuli that I've used in my research in the last few years. I've chosen not simple synthetic stimuli, I've chosen actual recordings, well, I should say, recordings of the actual acoustical instruments played at various dynamics, so I have more than one clarinet. I have clarinet played loud and soft. So here's a clarinet played forte, loud. There's the odd harmonics, there's the even harmonics. So it's not true that there are no even harmonics in a clarinet. There's some, but they're just greatly reduced. They're attenuated relative to the even harmonics. When you play an oboe in mezzo piano, halfway loud, well, halfway soft. You've got odd harmonics and even harmonics present. But now I'll show you what the actual stimuli look like in more than just the time and frequency domain. I'm going to show you in the time frequency domain. So that's why it has to be a 3D plot. Before I was showing you first the temporal waveform, and then I showed you the frequency content. Now I'm showing you both at once. I'm showing you the amplitude envelope over time for each harmonic at all the harmonic frequencies that sum to make the oboe played at mezzo forte. And if you look at it, it might look like what you think might happen with an oboe. Some things come up soon, some harmonics don't come up as quickly, and so forth. It makes it sound like a natural oboe timbre when you use this to generate your oboe. By the way, this is the result of an analysis which I then turn around and use for resynthesis of the same sound so that I can make sure that my sounds all have exactly the same pitch and exactly the same constant pitch throughout, so that when I ask you, can you hear the difference between an oboe and a clarinet, it'll be due only to your ability to hear the difference in timbre, not a difference in pitch and not a difference in, well, loudness. I can make them equally loud and equally pitched. Here's the clarinet. Notice the clarinet? It's got 1, 3, 5 on pretty strong. But look at 2, 4, 6. Those harmonics are only heard, only present during the attack. Do you know why that is? Think about what happens when you play a reed instrument. You're buzzing on a reed, and it makes energy at all harmonics, but the even harmonics die out very quickly. So it's almost just an attack transient. It's the transients at the attack that have other harmonics more than what happens later when you hear only those odd harmonics. And when you play it softer, notice what happens. I'll go back and forth between these two to make the point. Here's a soft piano, played piano. The dynamic we would call piano versus fortissimo. Fortissimo is very loud, and it has a lot more energy at the higher harmonics. So it'll sound what? It'll sound brighter. Not just louder, but also brighter. That's important because later I'm going to ask you how bright or dark these sounds sound relative to each other when I hold them constant and level. You have to be able to hear something like the variation over frequency then. Now, somehow this energy has to get into my cochlea that is being stimulated by that external processor that I wear on my head that talks to my cochlear implant. Here are the bands. These are filter bands that look at the audio input or the microphone signal that goes to the processor. These are the bands. They're at fixed center frequencies, and the first one's at 250 hertz. So that's at middle C. So if there's middle C present, the fundamental of that middle C note is going to hit the first band here, the red band, that has a center frequency of 250. And then if the second harmonic of that C, that's middle C, right? 251 hertz, 256 hertz is middle C. An octave higher is the second harmonic. That's the the orange, the yellowish mustard-colored band there. The 500 hertz band is where the next harmonic is going to show up. There's where the first harmonic shows up if you play a middle C. The second harmonic, the third, the fourth, they're all in different bands. Now, why did I do that? Why did I put them in different bands? Why did I arrange it like this? Because I really want to be able to hear out those harmonics separately. Even though I'm using my cochlear implant, I should be able to hear each harmonic's contribution to the timbre of these musical instruments. That's what I'm trying to do. That's why I chose to run this at middle C. And now I'm going to shift gears. I am a little more than halfway through my talk now, but I'm going to now get down to trying to compare the sound of musical instruments via cochlear implant in a rigorous experimental study. What are my objectives? Well, a final objective here was to determine whether audio signal processing designed to simulate CI-based effects on timbre could reduce the perceived dissimilarities between musical instrument timbre associated with normal hearing versus listening via CI, as assessed through between-ear timbre comparisons. Now, I hope you're following me. Can you guess why I'm doing that? I'm doing that because ultimately I have the goal of changing the way the CI does the processing, giving myself an upgrade so that the musical world as heard through my CI sounds more similar to normal hearing. I'm not the only one with that goal. There are many people who claim to be working on this problem. How do you make listening via CI sound more natural, sound more like it would to your normal hearing ear? Now, you might think that it's a very difficult task, and maybe it's not even one that we should try to do because it's so damn hard. But it's worth doing. We've made some progress. In my case, my personal case with my own implant, it's better now because I can modify, because I have the software to upload new code, new processing into my CI. I can make it work better. And I can tell you more about how I did that, if you like. That's not really the focus of my talk. My talk is how do you assess musical timbre perception so that you can make the progress something that is clearly meeting criteria that are objectively expressed. It's lovely that I can say it sounds better to me, but that's not going to drive development work. It's going to drive development if you have a rigorous scientific methodology that can be used to establish the criteria for the claim we have made an improvement. The satisfactory behavioral result that I'm after, it could validate an approach to quantitative assessment that could confirm the success of a CI simulation under test. Now, when I say CI simulation under test, I mean the changes in my own CI that I could make. I want to test to see if it's working better. So I simulate it first. It looks like it's going to do better, then I will try that out. It may be that such understanding of musical timbre perception by CI recipients will inform the development of improved CI audio signal processing, and indeed, potential rehabilitation programs for future CI recipients might be driven by this result as well. Wouldn't that be a good thing? What is the experimental design that I'm applying in these studies? You need to see that specified explicitly before I proceed. This research was designed to address questions regarding differences in timbral character of musical instrument tones as perceived by a single-sided deaf participant. I'm one of those. I'm single-sided deaf until you restore my hearing to my deaf ear with a cochlear implant. So, you take a person who is single-sided deaf, you restore their hearing with a cochlear implant, and now I'm going to compare that hearing to the normal hearing that I still have in my right ear. We call these single-sided cochlear implant recipients unilateral. Unilateral cochlear implant recipients, I recruited 8 of them to participate in these studies, and they were recruited because they were interested in participating in auditory training that might help them in rehabilitating their music perception and their music appreciation. So they came to me because they heard my presentations that are more general audience presentations than this one. I often give general audience presentations, and people come to me afterwards and say, I really want to try this because I want to see if I can do better with my CI. The initial objective here was to establish methods of stimulus preparation for synthesis and also the perceptual data collection tasks that could enable a productive study of CI-based capacity for differential assessment of musical instrument timbres. So now I'm going to finally get down to what I've done, and I have reported this once before. Back in February of 2024, the American Auditory Society meeting in the USA, it's every year in Phoenix, Arizona. We go off to talk to people who are interested in these issues for audiology. They're mostly audiologists at these conferences because they are treating patients who need to have their hearing restored with a CI. But this study was certainly not the first to focus on the important question of how do you make musical timbre perception better, or how do you improve music appreciation. There's this question that I've asked, how does music sound to a cochlear implant recipient? I'm not the first to have asked that question for sure. We've been asking that for, since the 80s. A recommended reference, though, in the area of music perception would be this reference by Valerie, just published in 2008. She's been working in this area for quite a while. But the current study that I want to tell you about was novel in that it focused on musical timbre perception of a small number of CI recipients who volunteered for an extended period of auditory training in musical timbre discrimination. To date, I only have 8 participants, and they volunteered because of their intrinsic interest, not because I was paying them a lot of money. They came to me because they want to do better understanding and appreciating music. So they were intrinsically motivated. Note also that one of the participants out of these 8, one participant had an individually fit, experimentally validated frequency place map. It was designed to yield an improved appreciation of music, which I also reported at the 2024 meeting of the American Auditory Society. You can guess who the individual was? Yes, it was me. I'm one of the 8 participants. My study with 8 participants includes me as one of the 8. So the other 7, you could say, are naive as to the reasons for my study. I was not naive. I knew what I was doing. So you might say that I'm a different kind of participant than the other 7, but I'm different in one more way, and I'm telling you about it right now. I was different because I had adjusted the filter frequencies, those bands for which I have 22. I have 22 bands that stimulate 22 positions on the basilar membrane. I picked the band frequencies so that they would correspond to the pitches that I knew I would hear for those 22 electrodes. This is never done. Nobody ever does this. Doesn't that kill you? Isn't that a surprise? I'm the only one who did that? Doesn't it seem like an obvious thing to do? If you're going to take 22 filter bands and they are each one has a center frequency starting maybe at 250 hertz, wouldn't you like the one that detects the presence of 250 hertz actually give you something that sounds like 250 hertz? Well, guess what? I can't. I can't give myself 250, but I can give myself 750. Why? When you put an electrode array into a cochlea, you can't go deep enough to get all the way around that spiral to where the low frequencies are transduced. The hair cells that sit on the basilar membrane down there, they get bent by something lower than 800 hertz only because they're deep in the cochlea, called the nearer to the apex, we call it. So I can only get down to about 750 or 800 hertz, but at least when I have a C note hitting the microphone, I can hear a C. It's 2 octaves higher, but I still can hear it's C. So my cochlear processing is different from most. I'm not the only one to have suggested it. Here's a study from 2011 by DiNardo, where they say that you can improve melody recognition for cochlear implant recipients through an individualized frequency place map. So there's the genesis of the idea. I did it, are you ready? This you're going to think it's a joke. The way I fit my frequency place map, I stimulated myself with a current at a very low pulse rate directly by software, directly talking to the processor, and I sang the pitch that I heard. Only under those circumstances can I hear a clear pitch, but when I heard the clear pitch, I could sing it, and I could then record my singing and analyze what the fundamental frequency was that I sang at. And so I can say, yeah, that's 750 hertz. So that's what I'm going to have whenever I have a 250 hertz input. So a C will stay C. Certain advantage there for musical harmony, for musical melody. Okay, so here it is. I've only got about 10 minutes left of my presentation, so I'm going to move quickly now. So first, what did we do? My 8 individuals, they complete pairwise comparison tasks, each exploring which of 2 tones dominates the other in terms of some selected attributes. And this will yield indirect scaling results for the relative dominance on these 2 attributes among the 12 tones. So why did I do this? Well, first is to assess the relative dominance on these selective attributes on attributes like darkness versus brightness. It's very easy. Everybody agrees on this one. When something gets brighter, everybody says it got brighter. So we all agree on that one. The other one's tough. A brassy versus a reedy sound. Well, brassy means an instrument that sounds like a brass instrument, and reedy, an instrument that sounds like a woodwind. And later, the participants are going to complete a pairwise comparison task where they rate how dissimilar 2 tones sounded relative to each other. And they do that dissimilarity judgment sort of globally without respect to any particular attributes, but this is going to be submitted to multidimensional scaling analysis to generate a 2D stimulus space. The underlying perceptual dimensions for those dissimilarity ratings. It's going to be handy to look at these 2 results together. So why am I doing this? I'm trying to derive a spatial configuration capturing the perceptual similarity among the 12 tones, and then I use the MDS software analysis to interpret the reported dissimilarities as interstimulus distances in a low-dimensional space. What do these things sound like? I'm not going to play too many of them because it's going to take a while. Oh, you're not going to hear it anyways. Oh boy. You haven't really got any audio, have you? You know what? I'm sorry about that. You have to listen very carefully. Nope. Did you get that? Okay, I'll just tell you what it was. That was an oboe versus a clarinet. One more time. Comparing brightness across different musical instruments. You can ask people to compare apples to oranges. Play a clarinet, play an oboe, and then say which one sounded brighter. And then you can ask this tougher question. Which note sounded more reedy or brassy? I hope that you can catch this up, pick this up. You're almost as degraded in your perceptual abilities as I am by the horrible way I'm transducing this with a microphone on my laptop, but we'll see how it goes. I think you could hear that, could you? 1 was a woodwind, 2 was, well, I'll play it again. You tell me, listen closely. Is the first one more like a woodwind or not? And is the second more like brass? Yes, it is. Okay, you can hear that. Oh, good. Everybody's nodding their heads. I like that. Okay, so now I'll show you the result from one individual. This is my participant number 8 on the brassy versus reedy result. And you can see I'm actually focusing in only on 8 of the 12 sounds here. BS1 was a bassoon at 1 brightness, and the other bassoon was at another brightness, and so forth. We have 2 clarinets, we have 2 French horns. But this result of ordering all of the sound stimuli, all of these orchestral instrument timbres on a dimension called relative brightness can then be related to the 2D result of a dissimilarity analysis. So dissimilarity ratings, not looking at any particular attribute, but coming up with a spatial configuration that just represents generally globally how different the things sound from each other. Here is a nice summary result for the 12 musical timbres. Again, as I've said, there's 1 and 2 on the clarinet and 1 and 2 on the oboe. They're just slightly different in the brightness because of the performance was either forte or mezzo forte or piano. But remember, these are all matched perfectly in pitch and in loudness and in duration. So they're all the same except for the timbral difference. So this is the indirect scaling result based on the 2 alternative forced choice task. This is the multidimensional scaling result, which honestly doesn't have any labels on the axes when you get it from the analysis. You just know there's a dimension 1 and there's a dimension 2. You need to figure out by correlating this configuration with the 2 underlying scales for the 2 attributes that you've looked at. So I correlated dimension 1 coordinates with the relative brightness scale that I got from the 2 AFC result, and sure enough, the first dimension is the brightness, and the second dimension is brassiness. Okay, now, I have to say that I've also done this, and this is the big punchline. I'm going to give it to you in 2 minutes. The big punchline is I can do the pairwise comparisons within my normal hearing ear. I can do the pairwise comparisons within my cochlear implanted ear. So I can do it with a CI listening and with a normal hearing ear, and then I can play the first and second tone for the comparison between my normal hearing ear and my cochlear implanted ear. So I can do 3 kinds of comparisons: within normal, within CI, and between normal and CI. And the great thing about the kind of MDS that I did, the multidimensional scaling has a variety called individual differences scaling. You can submit matrices of dissimilarity judgments from these 3 different types of comparisons to one analysis, and what the software produces for you is the weight that the normal hearing ear puts on those 2 underlying perceptual dimensions. For the normal hearing ear, you hear both dimensions very well, roughly equally. But for the cochlear implanted ear, it's all on dimension 1. Why? Because dimension 1 was brightness and you can hear it. The reedy versus brassy was harder to hear. Between ears, again, not great yet. It means it's not a perfect match between the left ear and the right ear in my case, so I'm not simulating perfectly for my normal ear what the cochlear implant side is hearing. Nevertheless, it's a good assessment. As I get better at finding exactly how to produce something that sounds to my normal ear, like what my cochlear implanted ear hears, then these will all converge. That's what we hope for. Okay, so conclusions. Wouldn't it be nice if I could do this in the next 20 seconds or so? Because I should be out of time. I got a stimulus space derived from individual differences scaling analysis. And the common stimulus space that I showed you before, it's generated from the 3 different kinds of dissimilarity matrices that were constructed from the 3 ways of doing the listening: normal ear, cochlear implant, and between the 2. And then here's my final slide. The conclusions are: an experimental result was achieved that allowed for the derivation of a quantitative relationship for differences in timbre as heard by the electric ears of 3 participants. The last one I showed you was just for 3 of us. Not everybody did so great. Not everybody finished the task, actually, of the 8. But for the 3 that I did finish before today, I'll finish the others later. When they compared to timbres as heard by the remaining normal hearing ears, we have a perceptual magnitude of the differences between within ear versus between ear. And what that means is you have to wrap your head around this. Having an underlying scale for dissimilarity that is common between all 3 of these comparisons means I can say to you, hear how different this sounds when I play these 2 sounds to your normal hearing ear. That's how different it sounds, roughly the same perceptual magnitude of difference when I play sounds between the normal and the cochlear implant. There's a real advantage here in having a common underlying scale of dissimilarity, because then you can say with real certainty that you have quantitatively measured the difference in such a way that you can say, the difference isn't that big between ears now, but it means my simulation is working. it sounds to my normal ear like it should be sounding to my cochlear implanted ear, and I have a rigorous quantitative measure of that here. Of what particular use is this? Well, it's so that I can continue to evolve my simulation and make the cochlear implant processing better so that it produces something that sounds more like a normal ear. Done. Finished. Thank you very much for your attention.